everybody to, I think, the 6th of our wonderful series. I don't think I'm being hubristic when I say it's been a wonderful series. Certainly I've both enjoyed it and learnt a lot and had new ways of thinking about things from many of our talks over the last few weeks. And today we're moving our attention, I think, from LeCoven Johnson to Susan Sontag, with a session that we've called Illness as Metaphor. As I said, with apologies to the really, I think, pretty fantastic book by Susan Sontag. And we've got 3 papers that I think address these questions in different ways. And this is, and I think this is leading us also into next week's session on pandemic metaphors during and in the pandemic, which is, has been in a way the background to all of to the whole series, or in a way that the prompting event for the whole series was the pandemic and language as a metaphor. But we've been edging our way towards that. So that's next week. And this week, I think some really great papers from all around the world. I think from Egypt, Portugal, and far away Wollongong. And it's from far away Wollongong that we're going to go first. My dear friend and good colleague, Gómez Romero, from law at the University of Wollongong. And his paper is entitled, although with Lewis, sometimes the titles shift around and change over time, If You're Not Human, Then It's All Different: Martians, Replicants, and the Metaphorical Legal Manufacture of Difference and Identity. Lewis, look forward to hearing your paper. I'm going to be pretty strict about the 15-minute rule, so be warned.
Thank you, Desmond. So let's get to it. The title comes from, is a quote, one of the android characters in Philip K. Dick's novel, The Android's Dream with Electric Sheep. Says, well, she's an android, she's discussing with a special, who is also this sort of degraded human. And she says, well, if you're human, then everything becomes easier. And this is the device, the narrative device of other worlds and their inhabitants, the aliens, alienus, the others, have been the repository of the fears and desires and hopes of human beings for ages. The prologue of the Spanish edition, or Spanish version of Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, that is the other literary work that I'm going to comment, was written by Jorge Luis Borges. And in Borges' prologue, he recalls the other worlds and how other worlds have populated the imagination of humanity well before Philip K. Dick and Ray Bradbury and their Cold War Martian fantasies. So Borges refers to Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. A major event in the plots of this play is the love story, the unfortunate love story between Angelica, a pagan princess, and Orlando, because Angelica falls in love with a simple soldier, with a North African soldier. And then she abandons Orlando, and this is what makes Orlando furious. So then Orlando begins destroying the whole world. It's an excessive scenario that encompasses the whole world, but also the moon, because Orlando needs the assistance of his friend, the English knight Astolfo, to recover his wits, to recover his sanity. And Astolfo flies up in Elias' flaming chariot to the moon. And Ludovico Ariosto tells us that in the moon, everything that was lost in Earth is to be found, including Orlando's wits. So he brings the wits, Orlando's sanity back in the bottle. Orlando sniffs his sanity, the wits, and then he's restored to normality. And at the same time, he falls out of love with Angelica, because Ariosto explains love is itself a form of insanity, is itself a form of illness. And this could give us a lot to think about metaphor and illness, but I cannot go into there because of the time limits. So I will limit myself to say that what this fantasy, Orlando Furioso, is telling us about other worlds is that we seek in other worlds what we have lost or what we ignore in our world. So men, human beings, have dreamt about Mars and other planets for centuries. And science, for the last few decades, has allowed us to confront what other worlds actually are. But those other worlds cannot be reduced to the scientific data that we have collected about them. Our dreams, our expectations, and our hopes as a species go with every real or imagined spaceship that reaches other worlds. And in this way, the scientific information that we have about those other worlds and our dreams about those other worlds interact. And in a way, both the Martian Chronicles, that is a collection of short stories that loosely form a novel published in 1950 by Ray Bradbury, and the Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, that is was published in 1968, are extended metaphors for this interaction. And this is relevant for the demands of justice and prudence, that is, on the way in which we put justice in action for the actual life of law and the way in which we experience law, because that's my field of speciality, jurisprudence. So this is a series of panels, or our central topic is metaphor. And a metaphor, in very simple terms, is a figure of speech that for rhetorical effect directly refers to one thing by mentioning another. Ricard famously defined a metaphor as a poem in miniature, poem en miniature. Ricard claims that metaphors have a cognitive function because they enhance our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of the world, by expanding the semantic field. That is, by allowing language to name realities or to formulate concepts that have not yet been named or have not yet been formulated. We could say that science fiction works inversely as an extended metaphor. Darko Suvin, the famous critic and academic who studied science fiction, claims that a feature of science fiction is cognitive estrangement. So this means that when we read a work of science fiction, the things that are familiar to us, the law that is familiar to us, the conceptions of justice that are familiar to us, suddenly become weird, strange, and we are able to question them. Now, both the novels that are uncommented, The Martian Chronicles and The Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, are Cold War narrative fiction, make Mars the repository of the anxieties of their age. In one of his vignettes, his mythologies vignettes, Roland Barthes comments on the proliferation of Martian narratives in the second half of the second century. And he refers them first to tropes of invasion, the fear on the western side of the Cold War of a Soviet invasion. And this is what the Martians represented, but at some point the paradigm shifts, and the Martians represented something else. The Martians, says Barthes, and I agree with him, become judges. They are the third party, the impartial part that comes, looks at the way we live, and shows the awkwardness of human life. The flying saucer, with its form, its curves, its smooth movement, just shows the awkwardness of our angles and the noise of the internal combustion motors. So this is what these novels are expressing. And illness plays just problematizes the plot in this in both narratives. In the case of Philip K. Dick's novel, Android's Dream with Electric Sheep, the world, the Earth has we are watching the Earth in the aftermath of World War terminus. And we are in a degraded environment. There is a radioactive dust that covers everything, that is reducing things, destroying, slowly dissolving things, and human beings and animals as well. So there are two categories of subhumans or degraded humans. One are called specials. They are just human beings who became ill because of the dust. And the androids. The androids are fabricated, produced human beings that Dick calls the humanoid robots, the organic android, and they have a limited lifespan of around 4 years. In the case of the Martian Chronicles, when the human beings arrive to the red planet, our first impression of the Martians is that they are horrible. They are like these petit bourgeois Americans, but we end feeling pity for them, because the first person, one of the members of the 3 first expeditions to Mars, is infected with chickenpox, and the Martians are infected with chickenpox, and they all die. Bradbury describes the way in which Martians are affected by chickenpox as if their bodies disintegrate. They become like autumn leaves, and only their bones are left. When human children, in a very haunting episode, meet with these bodies, they jump on the remaining flesh of the Martians as if it were autumn leaves, and they play the riffs of the dead Martians as if they were a marimba or a piano. And this problematizing of the scenario of the Cold War, of the alien, of the other with illness is speaking to us currently, because it just casts light on the distinction made by Roberto Esposito between community and immunity. According to Esposito, community comes from munus. That's the Latin term that in the Roman law meant a tribute, but also an offering or a gift. So to belong to the Roman community, that is cum munus, with munus, you had a duty, a law, an obligation, but also an offering or a gift. And there was also immunity. In negates the munus. So immunity is a dispensation or a privilege that exonerated someone from the duties that were common to all. That is immunity. And building on what Spanish philosopher Paul Preciado has recently written about the pandemic, this problematizing of the otherness, because this otherness in the novels of this science fiction consists the role of law. We see the law embodied in law enforcement officials. We see the law embodied in police officers who persecute the androids who come to Earth. They come from Mars to Earth. They are allowed to work in Mars, but they cannot be in Earth. And they are persecuted by bounty hunters that Ridley Scott renamed as Blade Runners in his filmic re-elaboration of the novel. And in the case of Bradbury, we also see the law in firemen who burn the memory of the Martians, who make a distinction between the horrible and the normal. These are Bradbury's words. So Paul Preciado says that the way in which the law asserts sovereignty, the way in which the law works, and here I'm going to draw from the work of another Spanish philosopher, jurisprudent, Javier de Lucas, works as guardian of time, as guardian of duration and repetition of society, and as guardian of identity, reflecting the way we deal with the pandemics. The thing is that the internal borders that have been structured today through the pandemics are limited to our bodies, to our own bodies. The border policies have come to our doorstep. So in this new biopolitics that has been developed through the pandemic, we are witnessing what was applied previously to refugees, to migrants, now is applied to everyone. We have a Lampedusa just at our doorstep, and our living rooms become the detention center. And there is also a modification of the subject, a new subjectivity that is built, in which everyone becomes the other, everyone becomes the alien, everyone becomes the Martian or the android. So this subject is radically isolated, as we have no lips, we have no tongues, we are a credit card, we are an address to which Amazon can deliver whatever we order online. And this radicalization, these novels, these Cold War novels, and this is, I'm going to wrap it up, this radicalization of the otherness that we have experienced through the treatment of the pandemic is already present in the problematizing of illness in those Cold War fantasies. When in his prologue to Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, Borges says, "Why do I feel terror and loneliness when I am reading about the invasion of another planet?" And he says, because this is a fundamental human experience, and Bradbury touched in it. And the fundamental human experience that we are touching now, that the pandemic has brought to us, is that the alien, and this is, I finish by citing Roland Barthes again, his reflection on Martians, the alien judge that comes and looks at us, and at the same time we reject as the other through legal devices or our conceptions of justice, emerges from the threat of the executioner, from the threat of that radical otherness that is the virus. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, that was that was wonderful, and it's amazing what you can accomplish in 15 minutes. I mean, it was very hard for me to keep up. I think I've roughly kept up, but I'd like to see a copy of the paper so that I can follow it through a little bit more slowly. But you covered an amazing amount of ground then, and I feel like I'm almost gone to Mars and back again, which, given the pandemic, we can only do that imaginatively. So it's the only way we can do it. So now we're moving, and I was glad to see the ways in which you brought illness in there, Lewis. We're moving to more specific embodied Terran experience of illness from Wesam Hassan, who works in anthropology at the University of Oxford, and she's going to be talking about HIV/AIDS and its metaphors in Egypt post-2011.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Desmond, for the introduction. And I will take you actually to the discipline of, we'll talk, because I'm an anthropologist and originally I am a physician, and my ethnographic field work was with mothers living with HIV in Egypt. And I can hear when I'm talking about metaphors, I have to examine the interlink between literature, philosophy, and anthropology, and see that because language and metaphors as we use it, it's like it can describe our realities, but at the same time it has meaning in the context that we use it within. And through this presentation I will talk about specific 3 metaphors that I figured in my work, in my ethnographic work on HIV and AIDS. Here for example, metaphors and literature, we try to bring back the human voice that sometimes we think that philosophy has lost it when philosophy is trying to abstract the ordinary lives. My work as an ethnographer and anthropologist allowed me to share lives with the people that I was conducting the work with, and to bring their voices together to provide evidence of their living, of the everyday itself. I worked before as a start, I have to mention that the way I see HIV and AIDS in this part is not as only a pathology. My positionality here when I entered, I looked at it as the women themselves who are mothers living with HIV, envision their living with HIV and the trauma of getting diagnosed with HIV. And it was kind of a moment of rupture caused by receiving the positive HIV diagnosis that created a state of psychological, emotional, and social disturbance in which they were living with fear of what would come next. This moment, I call it a moment of rupture, which is an anthropological concept, because at this moment of being diagnosed, my interlocutors had not yet configured new realities or routine. They suddenly faced the reality of their precarious living, which turned their imagined future into a distant past. For many of them, panic arose when they were forced to choose between holding on to their previous techniques of survival and the confusion of trying to configure new techniques to assemble a new living with a fragile immune system. Here, I conducted my work in 2014, and it was in the aftermath of the Egyptian revolution in 2011. And in February 2014, amid the political event that followed this Egyptian revolution, the medical team in the Egyptian military armed force announced a device that can cure and detect HIV and AIDS and hepatitis C. It was part of its political propaganda. And it was announced on the national TV in a conference, and they brought people living with HIV, and they said they were cured out of HIV. My fieldwork actually was with people who went through the clinical trial before the announcement of the device. This device has been scientifically criticized and proven as unsubstantiated and false. And this was not the first time that AIDS cures and remedies were announced and promoted by governments, like previous cases in South Africa, in Gambia, in Iran. But the incidence of the device made the issue of HIV and AIDS visible and part of the everyday rhetoric, metaphors, humors, and conversations of Egyptians who generally deny, stigmatize, and other HIV and AIDS as a foreign disease that does not exist in Egypt. Egypt generally has a low prevalence rate of HIV and AIDS, but statistics are not very transparent when it comes to the real number of people living with HIV, given the stigma around the topic and given that its mode of transmission. So HIV and AIDS here, when it's talked, it's not only a pathology that we can compare it like like hepatitis C in the Egyptian context, but it actually transcends the boundaries of a pathology to be kind of a prism that we talk through social issues, social taboos, and political involvement in the case of the cure. This device, this fraud device, and the accompanying discussion provoked questions of that how did an HIV positive person perceive this event and situate it within the overall social, political, and economic sphere of this particular moment of the Egyptian history in the 2011 aftermath, and also in the sphere of their everyday life in this period. How did they articulate this event and position it within their own narrative, including their treatment and care encounters? So actually, how was the device announced on the TV? It was announced by a person. He was working back then in the medical team in the military, and when he announced it as the complete cure device or the CC device. That's interesting because back then was in the front row of the attendees. It was the Egyptian president before he was the Minister of Defense, and his name is Sisi as well. So in the Egyptians, when they were talking about the device in this period, they would refer to the device as Sisi device as a metaphor of the prospective Egyptian president at this time, and later on he became the president actually as President Sisi in June. And also when the medical team in the army announced the device, they tried to simplify how it works in front of the Egyptians. So they said, actually, it's able to extract the virus from the body, and it can be you can use the RNA of this body, and you can cook it and make it like meat skewers as kofta. It's like a popular Egyptian dish, and then you can give it back to the patient to get nourished. So it was their way kind of simplifying that they are able to extract the virus from the body, and they are able to kill it, and just it will be like doesn't exist anymore. And it's very funny because all the media and the way people talked about this device, they named it as in relation to Kofta, which is, it was named the Kofta device by the people and some media outlets. And actually, this person who announced the device, he was kind of the main inventor of it, but it was approved and it was applauded by main figures in the Egyptian military who were sitting in the front row and main figures of Ministry of Health back then. So the military attempt to simplify the explanation of the mechanism and the efficiency of this CC device to the Egyptian public backfired at them, as the national media quickly they named this device as the Kofta device after it was named as CC device. Ironically, the semantics of using the word Kofta by Egyptians are as a spoken metaphor usually signifies the inefficiency or the nonsensical action or sayings or doing of a person. Naming the device as CC device or a Kofta device, it was kind of interchangeably used to refer to a kind of nonsensical way of governing Egypt and a nonsensical way of announcing a device that's a fraud. And it shows the awareness and witty ways of using humor and metaphors and dark comedy as a mode of resistance by the Egyptians. And I would pass to, that was one of the metaphors that I'm talking about briefly now. There is a second metaphor that I encountered in my fieldwork, which is a popular metaphor linking immunity to the army. But to look at it in the context of Egypt that was going through the military rule after 2011 and all the political unrest that we're going through, to conduct and ask the social workers about how do they relate to the social, to using immunity as a metaphor, army as a metaphor for immunity at this particular time. I had this conversation with an Egyptian social worker who provides counseling to people newly diagnosed with HIV. And he stated that when counseling new diagnosed people, he uses the metaphor that pictures the immunity system in the body as an army that defends the whole body against pathogens. When I asked him how the incident of the announced device and the political situation that was happening in Egypt at that time affected his work, and what does he think about this issue, this is his own word. He said, we use the metaphor that the immunity system is like the army of the body, and HIV is the enemy. So we need to make the army stronger by taking the medication. I think that people understand me better when I use this army metaphor now. And it also goes well with the current political talks and events in the country. During the device announcement, we were confused and we did not know what to tell the people who came to us for assurance. If actually the long-awaited cure for HIV was discovered by the Egyptian military. People living with HIV and people living with hepatitis C as well were checking with us if it's true that the armed forces has discovered the cure and that Egypt was able to find a great scientific, discover a great scientific invention like a cure for HIV and AIDS. The situation was vague and the country was highly polarized. If we responded as social worker to people who are asking us, who are living with HIV, that this is not true, that the cure is a fraud, some people of them would respond that we are not faithful to our army and that the army will not declare such an achievement unless they are sure. Any feedback from our sides as social worker or civil society will be politicized and translated into being with or against the armed forces. The truth is that we kept discreet and very cautious about our position during all this period that this device took this attention in the media and the talk, till it will just go into oblivion and people will not think about it later after all the propaganda around it will just go. So we remain, it faded away. HIV medication were already there and people started their treatment, but there was no cure for HIV as announced. Emily Martin, the anthropologist, in 1995 has argued that this image of an immunity system imagined as an army defending the body is replaced now by the image of the body as a mutable and constantly changing field, which is adaptable and flexible rather than a static territory that needs to be defended. However, I witnessed that the traditional image of the immune system as an army is still being used in Egypt, particularly when talking about immunity and HIV. The army immunity metaphor had resonated with the political events of Egypt at that time of conducting my research. It was also used in the conversation with my interlocutors to facilitate the transition to talk about immunity, about the fraud cure, about HIV. However, biologically speaking, the T cells, which is part of the white blood cells that constitute the immune system, have to remember the pathogen to be able to react to it. That's why they are called the memory T cells. When the T cells cannot remember the pathogen, the body fails to recover by itself and needs outside help, such as medical treatment. Therefore, the work of immunity is initially a work of memory. However, my interlocutors did not recognize it as such. They all assimilated the work of the immunity as related to the work of an army and defense, and they always used the army metaphor. HIV as a virus itself is somewhere between an object and a subject. As a virus and living organism that mutates, gets activated or dormant, it can give a sense of life within itself. One of my interlocutors said, I actually have a name for the virus. I call the virus Abbas. It is a name that my friends in the support group used to use it to joke about the virus or to hide that they are having the virus when they talk in public. For example, in a public place, we can ask each other, how is Abbas doing today? Or is Abbas treating you well today? In a secret language that only us would know, that we are talking about our HIV status and if we are tired today or not because of it. Abbas actually is a male name, and it's usually given to males. And it is worth to note that it is kind of heavy name that is used in ironic way, and in old Egyptian movies, we can find the informants who are working in the police or males who have like huge, big physique and named Abbas. So for the Kofta device, or for Abbas, it is the way how they were trying to simplify or link it with reality and the vernaculars that uses in the everyday life. So therefore, at the same time, talking about the relationship with the virus and the relationship with the objects and the relationship with the treatment and the pills that they used to treat the virus itself, it showed that they were trying to configure new social relations that's developed as a result of their living with HIV and AIDS, they tried to link it with some kind of reality or new routine that they were trying to figure in their everyday lives. Here, for example, I'm referring to a work by on ethics by Vinadas. It's called The Textures of the Ordinary. Here she was revisiting the actual lives of people and trying to assimilate how language and how concepts are being used in our anthropological work to refer to the actual lives of the people that we do the ethnographic work with. And actually, she is pro the argument that concepts does not exist above the actual lives and the everyday that the people go through. And yes, we use metaphor and we use concepts to try to simplify and understand how our relationship going with the reality and to make sense of it. Thus, quotes Wittgenstein, who worked a lot on language and language games, that a meaning a word does not have a meaning outside of its context. And this can refer, and also that we exist with language that used in our discourse. At the same time, the way we organize our reality, the way we try to make sense of the problems that we have. She quotes Wittgenstein when he says that that philosophy is a battle that we go through trying to counteract the bewitching of our intelligence and to work out our problems. It comes when we try to organize what we already know. I can use the same thing with metaphors, because we can say that metaphors and using the means of the language, it can rework the bewitchment of reality and as a way of feeling belonging, or it can be protective in some context that goes through political unrest or stigma and discriminate situation. So here I can
I'm sorry, I just need to say it's been really wonderful, but we are just about out of time. So I wonder if you'd be able to wrap it up at this point.
Yes, exactly. So
I'm sorry to do that because I've really found it interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Yes, actually, yeah. So this call actually and this events, it's made me revisit my fieldwork. It made me try to work on this hypothesis. It's still in progress and try to figure out what does metaphors tell represent reality or go into a dialogue with the hard reality of the people that they are living with. Thank you.
Look, that was terrific. And, you know, I don't think I've ever heard a paper which has made me better understand Nietzsche's line. You remember when Nietzsche says truth is a mobile army of metaphors. And I think that really just captures a lot. And as I said, really illuminates for me exactly what Nietzsche was trying to say in the ways in which he connected truth, army, and metaphor in that particular parable or epigram, I should say. So thank you very, very much for that. And now I believe we've got Coimbra on the line, and I'm very pleased to welcome Brisa Paim Duarte from the Faculty of Law at the University of Coimbra, the new virology of life and the metaphors of invisibility and change in law, philosophy, and politics.
Well, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I hope you all can hear me well. So what I am about to share with you today is a very brief reflection on possible relations between viruses and metaphor and between viral metaphors and the possibility of change. On the one hand, viruses become hyper-visible as they embody the phenomenon and the image of pandemic. They determine almost every aspect of our current lives as they keep being personified and shown in concrete experiences of sickness and in the permanent threat of the symptoms they produce. On the other hand, They remain hidden in their characteristic invisibility. Plunged into darkness, viruses are typically hostile to the optic paradigm, demanding prosthetic eyes and specialized knowledge to be seen. Their immunity to the eye highlights the permanent tension between the almost tactile, albeit self-deluding certainty to be ensured by vision and to be ensured by eye witnessing, and the inevitable fragility of the very act of seeing. In this sense, seeing is not mere reflex, it demands a performance. Viruses are prone so to metaphorical thinking. Unlike bacteria, they are borderline elements that necessarily belong in an apparent paradox to life and to its opposite at the same time. The opposite of life is then not death as the end of a biological body, but non-life as virotic experience, an experience of infection. To talk about the virology of life then embodies irony and paradox. Without meeting autonomously neither the biological condition for nor the temporality of life, viruses remake and perpetuate themselves only by appropriating the life they do not and cannot participate directly in, and in a sense, viruses can only become what they already are, both metaphorically and metamorphically. It is only through a disruptive metamorphosis in the infected living body that these non-living elements can become truly viral. The visible, hidden presence of viruses highlights the absence of certainties, both of those expected to be provided by sight and of those expected to be provided by the descriptive merits of referential language. Jacques Derrida's metaphors of Trace and Wooing Memoirs of the Blind remind us that the blindness in which we approach the trace of what we do not see is the precondition of seeing. Viruses act in this way like image in pure form, in the extent they expose the essential ambiguity of vision. What we do see is always a drawing of what we do not and cannot see. With that, I do not want to say that viral infection is a matter of wordplay or a matter of poetic imagination and fictional composition, but only that, as Rika already stated, at the symbolic level of the constitution of life and praxis, the performative logos of metaphor is a central artifact by the means of which virotic experiences acquire a very concrete, tangible dimension, shaping the ways a shared viral reality finds its condition of possibility. In this case, a pandemic reality in which the crude fantasies about contamination, to borrow the words from Susan Sontag, tends to magnify metaphorical effects. Maybe because of this, Soderbergh's movie Contagion was promptly rediscovered in pandemic context. The metaphor of a dystopic near future of contamination as one of the pervasive effects of predatory globalization was removed from the seemingly close but far enough discourse of fiction, and suddenly it became a sort of prophetic and direct reading of reality. The temporal dimension in which dystopia works was then withdrawn, and metaphor became everyday news. In pandemic, the already fragile frontiers between biological, non-biological, sociopolitical, juridical, philosophical, and technical, scientific dimensions of praxis are ineluctably submitted to an ongoing overlapping of discourses, intentions, and metaphors. This scenario is aggravated by the entropy of a digital age characterized by the emptiness of virtual hypervisibility, in which endless repetition of immaterial data and mimetic thinking multiply in public dialogue, going beyond familiar mechanisms of imitation and mimesis. In this manner, the hypervisibility of viral information contrasts directly with the invisibility of viral existence. These new forms of contagion give rise to an autonomous virotic experience as they also feed previous experiences. In fact, as Ricoeur affirms, metaphor is more than a figure of speech, a dogmatic category. It is not simply a feature of the formal structure of the semantic level of discourse. It is a strategy to redescribe and redraw the reality in a certain way, exploring the creative potential of language to structure a certain type of dialogue. In this way, metaphor is not necessarily a way to tell a lie, a way to mask the truthness of some out there reality or the alleged purity of language, but a poetic device to create meaning and to construct the truth. That is, to construct an unexpected interpretative frame for creating reference. It brings fiction and reality together, or to be more accurate, it shows that fiction and reality are already together, walking side by side. Metaphorical interventions initiate a referential structure of their own, based on a deflection of the expectations of certainty and meaning. To Aristotle, in his well-known first definition in Poetics, metaphor, before it is a maneuver to set the practical ability of eloquence in motion, is already the expression of a type of transportation or change, since it consists in transferring to one thing the name of another. So metaphors are one of the symbolic mechanisms we can employ to make sense of the many worlds we live in, both understanding and acting concretely in the realities we share, and we can only share the reality dialogically. In the betrayal of the expectations of literal meaning, metaphor distorts the convention of language, releasing the power of new interpretative conventions based on such a distortion. As we know, the comprehensions of diseases as phenomena always have been linked to metaphors. Long before Susan Sontag's well-known approach, one has to remember Thucydides' description of Athenian plague. The plague and the war are put in logical symmetry, as if the terrible and terribly unknown illness that has stricken Athens was more threatening than the war itself. The disease, in fact, in the words of Thucydides, plays the role of a war enemy by its own merits. He says the plague, as a sort of divine punishment, exceeds in its particular cruelty the capacities of human nature and body to endure it. In fact, the unknowingness of illness defies all attempts to describe it. As Thucydides enunciates, it is a kind of sickness which far surmounted all expressions of words, so it can only be framed metaphorically. Today, we are daily exposed to the metaphors associated with COVID. Long before COVID, some of them were used to describe cancer, for instance. They are mostly military metaphors, as Sontag stated. The reference to invasion and abnormal growth of cancer immunity and self-defense are now used to illustrate viral infection and curves of transmission, dissemination in populations, old waves and new waves of contagion, etc. The social body is an organism that must defend itself from the threat of an enemy that came suddenly, even if rigorously, in this case, it had not. These are also colonial metaphors. The image of the virus colonizing the cells, conquering them and winning is now a commonplace. The globe is in a war against the mysterious other, came from the wild who wants to destroy civilization. In the age of risks and uncertainty, metaphor thrives as a tool to give fear a name and a concrete existential body. And as such, it projects inwards our own civilizational vulnerability. Not by accident, one of the first fake news and one of the first fears about COVID was that it was a biological weapon. The phenomenon of disease ceases to be seen according to a pathological mindset in a proper sense of the word, that is the logos of the pathos, the affections and crises of the body, and starts responding to military logic It is transformed into military business, and it is answered to in terms of warfare economy. Although populist presidents keep using strengths and weakness metaphors to misrepresent COVID's risks in order to keep predatory capitalism running without change, social institutions in general make cost-benefits analysis and count collateral damages. Images of grief and funerals remind war photographs well enough. Medical workers are frontline soldiers to whom people paid tributes with military punctuality by clapping their hands at balconies. The law, of course, absorbs this military rhetoric. In Portugal, between March and May, in order to institutionalize the obligation of restrictive measures, it was decreed with the support of the population the state of emergency, which, albeit provided for in the Constitution, can be considered exceptional in a certain way since it suspends the exercise of freedoms, rights, and guarantees. At metadogmatic level, one can reflect on the type of rhetoric backing up the vocabularies of such constitutional institutes. Once established, they impose a paradigm shift in both juridical and social-political imaginary. They normalize the vocabulary of war and defense and are reenacted as a clear possibility of population control in societies progressively consumed by the language of risk and its metaphors of war and privation. But there are still other metaphors to which viruses are prone. The impact of old and new, visible and invisible infections in the uneven fabric of global community makes it urgent an embracing reflection that goes beyond the traditional versions of ecological discourses. From the point of view of legal philosophy, it is necessary to rethink not only the anthropological grounding sustaining the comprehension of juridical personhood, but also the relationship between the juridical subject and the biosphere, a relationship that goes beyond individualistic survivalism. It demands a language that, overcoming legalism, touches a principle of ethical juridical responsibility for a community of life as both solidarity and solicitude, understood as a vital condition for human beings and ontological and normative condition for the practical experience of law. In the midst of the crisis we face, to sum up, the radical physical atomacy of viruses insistently obliges us to confront ourselves with the full blindness that nurtures every gesture of writing and representation, directing the so-called global community to an extreme practice of metaphorical thinking, creating the imagination to deal with the multiform challenges of new virologies. Pandemic defies us to an exercise of writing in blindness and as blindness, combining critical philosophical analysis and metadogmatic thinking in order to reimagine the possibility of justice and the possibility of life. It is precisely the imperative of life and not the pure fear of death that demands that today we open our eyes in the dark night to write without seeing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And you know, as I've said before, I'm just really incredibly grateful and impressed by the quality of the papers that we've got and the dedication of people to be up at all hours of the day and night. You know, some of us in the middle of the night, some of us foregoing our lunchtime siesta in order to participate in this conversation. So I'm going to, at this point, thank everybody and ask from questions, either from panelists to each other or from members of the audience. You can just start speaking, or you can just send me a quick note on the chat line to say that you've got a question to ask, and we'll take it from there. And while people are thinking, I'll just say, one of the things that I found really interesting was I think we've started to get some really terrific definitions of metaphor in today's talks in particular. Lewis spoke about the expansion of the semantic field, and also mentioned the idea of a metaphor as a poetry in miniature. And Wesam, amongst other things, as I said, I was reminded of Nietzsche in what Wesam had to say, but I also very much like your reference to the metaphor as a prism for talking. And I think that's a nice definition of metaphor, although it suffers from the fact that it's actually a metaphor. So maybe there's something circular about that, although I find that like the language of prism actually for me is really quite suggestive about what's going on when prisms are being related to, or inevitably related to, social contexts and political contexts in the way in which they are being deployed. And I think that the third paper was also kind of brought in many of those kinds of aspects. So I just have one, I mean, I guess quite a specific question, which I'll use to sort of kick off the discussion to Lewis. And I'm just thinking, I suppose I'm just thinking about another text that your paper's in dialogue with Lewis, that, you know, that Philip Dick story, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? As you know, it's really quite a profound question. And it's a profound question going to interiority and otherness and different kinds, both semantically and conceptually, our understanding of others and so on. And it strikes me that was a story, I think, first published in about 1968. And not very long after that, Thomas Nagel, we have one of the great philosophical papers of the 20th century, which is, What is it like to be a bat? And it just strikes me that Nagel's paper is interesting, but Philip Dick really got there first, and that the question that Nagel is asking and the question that Philip K. Dick is asking are really in a way the same questions. So I'm just thinking about the possibility of engaging what Nagel says philosophically in what is being dealt with through the fictional devices of these short stories, and through and I suppose I'm wondering if a possible answer to Nagel's question goes through the appeal to literature as a way of, in your language, expanding the semantic field. But really, if we think about science fiction, it is perhaps expanding the semantic field, but it seems in a way also to be about expanding the material field, the embodied field, right? Bringing us into another place of embodiment, and then trying to use fictional devices to imagine ourselves in that embodied world with all its different parameters and its different experiences. And that I suppose that connection between language embodiment is something that seems at the heart of the stories you're looking at, and the argument about otherness that you want to develop. It also seems to be the heart of what Nagel is trying to deal with.
Yes, this is so the novel addresses the issue, the big question of what it means to be human. And at some point, the character of Rick Deckard, that is the bounty hunter or the Blade Runner in Ridley Scott's filmic recreation of the novel, asks the question: so do androids dream? And he answers, yes, they want a better life. But the entire novel is an exploration about what makes you human, would it be your empathy? Because that's as the environment is destroyed, it seems that what characterizes humans, because androids have this very short lifespan, is their empathy towards every living creature, even insects. But animals have become this symbol of statu quo. So it's not about caring for the environment, but actually possessing an animal and then showing your status through the property over the animal. And having an electric animal, because Rick Deckard has an electric sheep, is just having this degraded status. You may be silent about that, but to reach the full citizenship, your full humanity, you needed to possess a real animal. And then the question is, well, what happens about, for example, about memory? What happens if is it our memory that makes us human? And Philip K. Dick plays with this. Memories can be fabricated. Actually, another short story that was also destroyed by a very beautiful short story destroyed by Arnold Schwarzenegger, Total Recall. It's about corporations making out or building our memories and then selling us the memories. We can choose to have false memories. So it is not the past, it is not the future, it is the experience of the present, and the experience of the present is quite complex. And the entire, just as in Nagel's paper, the entire novel, just and Dick's reflection builds around this. And in the end, it is an inquiry into who gets included, who gets excluded from discourse, or from our conceptions of justice, from law. What is the difference between, and because another thing that I have been, and with this I finish, and it relates to the way we are thinking the world, and how these novels and Nagel and reflecting about the other and the virus just speak to our reality today. Around mid-September, the Vice Chancellor of Melbourne University, Duncan Maskell, gave some controversial declarations about, well, we need to think about if we are how comfortable are we with death regarding the pandemic. And his conclusions are we need to think about this in economic terms, as what he calls a quality assessed life year. And he basically said, well, the life of a young person of 25 years is more valuable than the life of someone who is 90 years old. That's and we need to acknowledge this in order to administrate the pandemic. So basically what he's talking about is creating a case of specials in Dick's sense. That's the people who are disposable, who cannot, who are not entitled to the protection of the health system or the health devices of the community. And this is literature indeed, or this and all the metaphors just cast light on this, because just making this question, we need to make the questions, but what are you talking about? This question is not only terribly strange, it's as if we are suddenly pushed into Dick's world, but it is also horrible, just as having Blade Runners persecuting the androids. That's yeah, thank you.
That's great. Great. Okay. So I'm still I'm calling for another question. Somebody.
I'll ask a question.
Carlos, that'd be great.
Thanks. I really enjoyed all three papers. Really interesting. But I have a quick question for Wesam. I thought there were various kinds of metaphors being discussed and presented for us in your paper. But what kind of struck me was that in a way the HIV as masculine abbas, and then the device or drug, if I'm not mistaken, also being renamed as Al-Sisi, that in a way those metaphors there were slightly different kinds of metaphors, right? They were kind of appellations, they were kind of renaming, and that in doing so they were kind of masking, hiding, but also perhaps protecting, in particular when you were talking about the people suffering HIV and renaming the virus Abbas. Anyway, so I just thought it'd be interesting to hear you say a few things about that, about this metaphor as renaming and as protecting, masking, hiding.
Thank you, Carlos. Yes, it's true. Both of them are masculine figures and masculine names. And in particular, in this regard, metaphors, in every case of them, yes, there was masking, there were hiding, and there was kind of protection. But at the same time, from where those names and this context that were driven came from. Part of the things as well, even the name Sisi, when it came as a device, it was like related to the first two letters of the complete cure device. And at the beginning, it was not related to masking the device itself, as rather than actually it's bragging by the scientific invention that can be named after a name of a potential or a future president who was attending the conference as on his capacity as a Minister of Defense at that time. So at the beginning of using the name of the device, it was kind of fired back later after, but actually it fired back by media and by people in the street when they said, one of my interlocutors said, I did not feel, she did not go for that, well, this person did not go for the clinical trial. And she said, I did not feel that once naming the device as CC device as the first two letters of the complete cure, and I see CC, the person sitting in front row, I felt that there is something that's being linked between this naming and the person in terms of accumulating power or running for the elections. And here, the interlocutors don't go into theorizing how this relates to the political sphere in the country at that time in our conceptual way of saying it and putting concept to it. But they say it in simple words. Like, for example, I did not feel comfortable because he will run for a president and he will come for this kind of election. And it was kind of ironic for me because if I went to this device and it was supported by the military and anything went bad, who can be prosecuted here? You cannot put a suit under trial. And when she referred to suit, which is the military suit. So you cannot put a military person to be kind of asked or punished or put into question or held accountable for any act that might harm the people in this regard. So their feedback was various between both. Some of them linked that they are part of a national invention and they went through the clinical trial, and others were like from the beginning, no, this actually feels weird. This is linked to other political situation. We are being used in a political propaganda in a way or another. So here metaphors was used by not only to protect, but to kind of promote at the beginning thing, promote a person in subconsciously or consciously in front in the political rhythm in a way or another. But the other way of using the metaphor of HIV as Abbas, I was actually really surprised by this one because I understood that I knew from the interlocutor who was a mother, who was a female, and how can we relate this to the inherited forms of gender disparity and structural violence that women can go through and they go through in their lives. And part of it, actually, most of the women that I met, they related their HIV infection to a male figure. That after that they knew that they got infected, whether through betrayal from their husbands, whether through betrayal from other forms of things and stories in their lives. So I wanted to make sure if actually she is just the one naming him Abbas or others. So in my work, I talked with social workers and other people who are living with HIV, and it was also the same name by male figures who were living with HIV. So I tried to trace the genealogy, who started or why it was envisioned as a male figure. And one of them, he said, I don't know exactly when it started, but it has been the name for it when we talk only between us. And you can look at all the Egyptian movies and see informants or people who are working in the police as informants or people who torture prisoners, you will find always that some of them named Abbas. So it is conceptually, it is fascinating to see how people drive metaphors from the pop culture and the media, but it's also predictable. But that does not, we can talk about this conceptually. However, I look at HIV, I look at the responses and their everyday life as not romanticizing it as a metaphor or linking it, because it's a reality. And it is a painful reality when you relate that they actually try to make friends or social relation with a virus that is named after kind of certain figure that draw from Egyptian media or movies. So in this case, it might protect them when they talk their own special secret language between each other. But I find it as, it can be also invasive. It can act as a trigger for many things and traumas in their lives. But at the same time, what is fascinating is how they reconfigure the everyday, naming that or reclaiming that it was, for example, for the device, okay, yes, Sisi is the president now, but it's called the Kofta Device, which is nonsensical, and how it relates to the mood of governance. Yes, it can be named Abbas, but at the same time, I will have to try to figure out and make peace with it and understand, going back to Lewis, the relationship was more than human or a different, or as Brisa said, the virus as an invasion. So, but it is a daily process, but it is also painful, traumatic process. We can link it with metaphors of being colonized as a body, we can even go further and say the settler native metaphor of colonized body with the virus. But I don't want to also use the colonization metaphor a lot in other forms or other contexts other than the material way of settler native places, like not only use it for the body and not only use it for schools, like to decolonize our curriculum, but in this context we can go with our imagination and link the dots. But what remains is the reality. And I would like to quote Lewis here. What it is not about the past, it's not about the future. And it's about their present moment when they're trying to figure out every day. And I'm not sure that all of them would call, for example, the virus, because they are living with it as in their bodies as a best. There was only one person at the end of my field work. He is a male figure. And he said, I imagined myself that I have to love it because I might say, I might be kind of pregnant with it. I tried to, even after that, to try to figure out and make sense of it. Ask women, how do you feel when you are having something in your body as growing, as a linked with pregnancy, not with cancer? So this is yet to be more and more detailed, and how every person with their personality relate to it would differ from a context and a backstory of a person to another.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful, actually. Another question. I think we've certainly got time for another couple of questions.
I have a question, Mr.
Oh yeah, Lewis.
So it's a question for Brisa, and because I was your suggestion about seeing and becoming blind, perhaps a metaphor is a way of orientating our gaze. If we think about how other epidemics have been dealt with in the past, for example, the epidemic of syphilis in the 16th century. So syphilis was a scourge from the 16th to the 19th century. The outbreak was in Napoli around the 1490, if I'm recording correctly. And it first, so the English called it the French malady, the French illness, the French, no, it's a Neapolitan illness. And then the Neapolitan said, no, it came from the New World. It came from those dirty Amerindians were the ones who infected us. And from here, from this blaming, from this orienting the gaze towards the otherness, because the virus is always this radical otherness, then emerges a persecution of prostitutes, and with all that that this entails. There were women who were using their bodies to make a living, frequently racialized. And it was, when we think about what happened, it was, in the end, it was not the crackdown on prostitutes what ended the syphilis. It was penicillin, in the discovery of penicillin in 1928. So building on what you said, what do you think about perhaps this metaphor as a way of orientating or conducting the gaze, the way in which we see the world, and therefore from this emerges this ethical imperative, this ethical requirement to resist that, to resist sometimes metaphor, conducting our gaze in those ways, and to become blind.
Thank you, Luis, for your great question. I think that the blindness, in the Hegelian sense, it functions more as a metaphor. Of course, it is another metaphor amidst of the many metaphors with which we are already dealing with. And in the sense, this blindness, it can be taken in Saramago. Yes, Desmond. Remember, yeah, Saramago, of course. And then this sense of blindness, it can be assumed in two ways, I think. One, as an absolute opening. I think that this is the ethical one, the ethical imperative, and so on and so on. But it has also a negative sense. So it can have also a negative sense that is a kind of villainization of the enemy, a discourse of the enemy. So I'm blind to the other in the same extension that I'm open to the other. So I think that it can be assumed in these two assertions. I don't know if I'm touching the point that you wanted to, but
yeah. Thank you. Still waiting. One more. No one. All right, I'm declaring victory. I want to thank everybody for, I think, what was really some fabulous talks. They've certainly given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure they have for everybody who's come along here too. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you in particular to our three speakers, Luis, Wesam, and Brisa. That was really wonderful, and above and beyond the call of duty for those of you who've stayed up so late for this. I really appreciate it. And, I started to get in my head all of the weeks that we've been talking about these things, and it's building into a kind of a rather, not unwieldy, but a richly integrated and a web-like structure in which the papers all start to talk to each other. Thank you very much for that. Next week, we continue our thinking about disease and illness in relation to metaphor with 3 papers that are more closely connected, although there were certainly very strong connections today to the current pandemic, and we continue that theme in next week's papers. So hopefully everybody can come along and join the discussion and listen with the sort of rapt attention we've had here today next week. Meanwhile, for me, That's it. Thank you very, very much. Bye-bye.